Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we are going to, as I told Chris when I suggested this topic, we are going to tread where angels fear. And we're going to be talking about a political, constitutional, legal theory. I know that sounds like, okay, we're getting ready to dust the chalkboard here, but I promise this will be interesting, called Unitary Executive Theory. And it has been a issue that has been of growing concern, at least since the Nixon administration. Um, but now with the Trump administration, things have really intensified. And Chris, I think at the end of the day, it all boils down to how one understands the Constitution.
And I think, that's the key thing is the Constitution is a living, breathing document, something that continues to expand and to be discussed and talked about. And, we do not really understand what the founding fathers had in mind when they were drafting the Constitution, nor did they have any idea of what the 21st century would bring to American society. And so you have this document, which is the foundation of our system of government. And yet it is one that is subject to debate and to people providing their own opinions. And, for instance, you can sit there and talk both sides of Amendment 2 as far as, the right to own a firearm and what does that mean? You can sit there and debate what it means freedom of speech and what freedom of speech do I really have. But in this particular situation, what we are talking about is, I think, what comes to the root of I don't want to say the problem, but the root of the issue, which is the constitutional understanding of rule of law, which is that everyone, including those in government up to the highest position imaginable in government, say the President of the United States, is subject to and accountable under the law, and that the law is followed by all persons. And in this situation, we have an individual, President Trump, who is looking at the executive branch, which we've done some studies on the executive branch before, but the executive branch is this large government body. And the question is, well, who gets to decide what happens within the executive branch?
Yeah, and you were talking about, and I do want to, before we keep going, I do want to go. You were talking about interpreting the Constitution, and it just came to my mind. I remembered that, the Constitutional Convention was held over the summer of 1787. They adjourned in September of 1787, and immediately upon adjourning, the debate over ratification, which of course happened in the individual states, began until it was finalized in New Hampshire, which became the ninth state to ratify the Constitution, thus making it the law of the land. But you look at these people during the ratification debate, then during the Washington administration, and what you find is the very people who were in the room when the Constitution was being put together, the very people who were involved in penning it and arguing about it and debating it, those very same people disagree sometimes over what it allowed or didn't allow. The perfect example that came to my mind was Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Hamilton argued that the Constitution allowed, under the necessary and proper clause, allowed the federal government to establish a bank of the United States. James Madison looked at that and said, whoa, wait just a cotton picking minute here. If the federal government can establish a bank of the United States, on what basis? Where is it? So when we talk about people disagreeing over the Constitution, man, it has been going on since day one, which has always been something that, and Chris, you know me, I can be something of a contrarian sometimes. Say it ain't so, I know.
Not Ray Shepard, no
Not
way.
me, no. But every once in a while, I used to hear people say something like, oh, we need to get back to the Constitution. We need to get back to the Constitution. And I always wanted to look at them and say, well, how do you define that? because when George Washington became president in April of 1789, Article 2 was bones. It didn't have any muscle. It didn't have any tendon. It didn't have any flesh. He had to sort of start working that out. And of course, that involved his interpretation, Madison's interpretation, Jefferson's interpretation, etc., of what it meant in Article 2.
And so we come to that Article 2 of the Constitution, which basically says that the President of the United States is in charge, if you will, of the executive branch. And, why is this controversial right now is because you see an incoming president, they call it Trump 2.0, who has come in along with some people, and they have this idea that the best thing that they can do for the country is to reduce the size of the federal government or to change certain parts of the federal government, and specifically, that group within the Article 2 of the executive branch, and the executive branch, I don't remember, I forget the number, but I want to say it's like 4 million people that actually have a job within the executive branch. And so you have a president who has come in and said, we're going to slash particular things. We're going to make some different things change. And that's something that is happening right now, where he is trying to assert that theory, that purpose.
Yeah, when we think of unitary executive theory, that's exactly what it focuses on. It focuses on, within the executive branch, who does the president have the ability to fire? Well, obviously, well, maybe not always obviously, but today we sort of take it as for granted that the president can fire the Secretary of State. The president could fire the Attorney General. But the question is, what about civil servants? What about people who work jobs that are not political, professional, civil service jobs? Does the president have the ability to fire those? Other questions, of course, come in with what is the role when we think about the executive? What is the role of the judiciary with the executive? What is the role of the legislative with the executive? How much influence or power do they have over the executive? I think one of the things that when we think about unitary executive theory, we have to accept is that the Constitution does say in Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. That places the president of the United States at the top of that food chain we call the executive branch of government. But does that mean that the president of the United States has the power to just fire anyone within that branch with no checks and balances? Does it mean the president has the power to do anything, order anything within the executive branch without any checks and balances? And Chris, I think that phrase checks and balances is where it all lies. Did the framers of the Constitution, when they wrote Article 2, did they envision a president that was pretty much above check and balance? Does that make sense?
It makes sense because it goes back to the whole concept of rule of law. And that is that, and be honest, President Trump has dealt with this concept and rule of law in his first presidency, that, there is no president who has the rights to do whatever they want to do because they think it's what is in the best interest. And I remember reading something, and by the way, history you didn't know but should. This is one of those topics that I knew nothing about. This was not something I was really invested in. And I love the Constitution. I love all of that, but it's one of those just not familiar things that are out there that has kind of been brought back to the forefront. And I did find it interesting that it really goes back to the origins of where people started testing the checks and balances and testing rule of law. Isn't it interesting that it goes back to the days of Richard Nixon?
Yep.
That it's Nixon who we know kind of left the presidency in disgrace, but he kind of comes in and starts trying to do these things. But it's basically saying, and maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but I'm the law. My will is the law. My view of the law is what matters. And so as president of the United States, if I come in and I say, you know what, the Department of Health and Human Services is one of the worst institutions we've ever had, and so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to get rid of the leader. I'm doing that all because I'm the president. 70 million people voted for me. They've elected me to be the person in power, and so therefore I don't care what Congress says. I don't care what the courts say, and I really don't care what anybody else says. I'm going to do this. Now, I might be just being very loose with that argument, but that's really what's happening in this. And is the Health and Human Services, maybe they've got some issues that need to be addressed. Sure. Maybe there's some things that need to be cut. Sure. But do we run into a problem when we tell one person, you have the power to do whatever it is that you think is best for the sake of the United States of America? That's a lot of power put on one person.
It is. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. There is how much power do you put on a single person? I don't think, just my opinion here, Chris, I don't think the founders, whether you're talking about a George Washington or a Benjamin Franklin or any of these guys, I don't think any of them would have been comfortable with the idea that you have one person with as much power as the president of the United States has today. Certainly very different from Washington's time in the presidency, that one person has the ability to single-handedly basically overhaul the entire government without the checks and balances from Congress, without the check and balances of the court. With Congress, you talk about Health and Human Services, Congress created that department. Congress funds that department. Does the president have the authority to just ignore the actions of Congress and defund the department or cut funds to the department? Where does the judiciary come in? One of the things you were talking about, Richard Nixon, one of the things that the Nixon people argued was that, there were certain things the president did which were just out of the reach of the courts. Now, I think the courts rejected that. But it's the same type of thing we're hearing today. If, Trump, he said after he left office in 2021, he made the comment over the issue of the documents that were at Mar-a-Lago down there in Florida. He made the claim that if I, as president, decide they're declassified, they're declassified. So it's sort of, I'm the power, I'm the one, and nobody can really touch that type of thing. I think that's a fair assessment
I
of what this
remember,
is.
there was something that President Trump said, and I'm not knocking President Trump. I'll say this about any particular president because I remember that George W. Bush Jr., the son, he comes in and he really basically sees this unitary executive theory gain traction because he's trying to use unprecedented presidential powers. This is coming towards the concept of we're at war. We've just had the 9/11, and he's thinking about, I remember the concept of waterboarding to try to find out how can we get information from these terrorists, Guantanamo Bay, so all of these things that happen to gather information. You remember there was a big controversy about how we were gathering information from these particular individuals. And he basically said, well, I have the right to do that under Article 2. These are, presidential powers that have been given to me by the Constitution. So it's not just Trump that is, as we mentioned, Nixon also, but this has been in use in many different ways. But I think maybe it is being seen now because, first of all, technology.
Yeah.
And second of all, there's just a large majority of people that disagree with the way that the president is handling government. And so there's more scrutiny, if you will. There's more news focus on this. So yes, it was done during Nixon. It was done even during Reagan. It was done during George W. Bush Jr. But now with just so much divisiveness, there's more attention to it. But Ray, I go back to one thing you said. If one individual is going to ignore the will of the legislative branch of Congress, well, how easy is it to ignore the decisions of the judicial branch? And you and I talk government 101. what the job of Congress is to make the law. The job of the courts is to decide that the law is legit, and the president's job is to enforce the law. You
Yep.
know, those are the three main duties of each one. And so we then have to ask, well, how are they working in conjunction with one another if you have one body that is deciding to do what they want? I'll say one other thing, and this might be contradictory, but you have a president and his government officials that are now talking about these quote rogue judges,
Mhm.
you know, and well, if you're going to say that a judge is being rogue and is kind of going outside of their sphere of influence, then you have to kind of ask yourself, well, am I going outside of my sphere of
Right.
influence also?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you know, you were talking about Congress. It's been very disturbing to me, just on a personal level, how inactive Congress has really been. Congress has become, you know, I mean, they've done some stuff. I'm not saying they haven't done anything, but you know, in this first 100 days or so of the Trump administration, we've seen very little action coming out of Congress as far as legislation. And one of the criticisms I have of the way the Trump administration is going about some things is there's a lot of things they're doing or trying to do that they could have done through legislation, through the legislative process that you talked about, where Congress makes the law, the president signs the law into it's Congress puts together a bill, a piece of legislation, the president signs it into law, and then begins to enforce that. So there are things that this administration I think could have been getting through Congress. And I think that would have raised less concern about the powers of the president and unitary executive theory. And this concern that you just brought up about the president, the executive doing basically the job of the legislature too, and then deciding to ignore the courts. And, you know, Chris, this is, and you mentioned this a minute ago too, this isn't new. I mean, there was a guy called Arthur Schlesinger back in the 70s wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency. I mean, you know, this has been a concern that has been building for some time, and I think people who think that Trump is sort of the problem are ignoring the what came before him, which was building it, building it, building it, building it, and he's just the latest example of a president that's building it, and whoever's president next was likely to build on what he's done.
One of the things, go back to even the founding fathers, one of the fears of electing a president was the drug of power
Mm-hmm.
and how it could easily take them into a back then a king role, and nowadays maybe more of a dictatorial role. But at the end, you know, you kind of think about Napoleon in France, and you know, basically Napoleon or Trump having that Napoleon complex, which basically says he who saves his country does not violate any law.
Right.
In his mind, he is saving the country. In his mind, the changes that he is making is for the betterment of the country. I mean, I think we need to make sure that very clear.
Yeah.
I am not denigrating the president of the United States. In his mind, he believes that these things that he is doing is for the best of the country. He believes that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that some would even agree with him that these cost cuttings and these changes
Mm-hmm.
are good. The
Mm-hmm.
tariffs and are
Mm-hmm.
good. I mean, there are things that are good. I think it's the approach.
Right.
You know, if the house is on fire, you know, what you want to go and try to do is save the house. And to save the house doesn't mean you go and knock down 5 different areas, you know, just to get to the fire, but that you take your time and you try to hit the hot spot, and you hit that hot spot without trying to destroy the whole thing. And so I think it's just this shotgun approach where there's
Yeah.
just shotgun blasts going everywhere, and people are just having a hard time really understanding, you know, the who, what, when, where, why.
Yeah. It's sort of baby, you know, toss the baby with the bathwater type of thing. And one of the things I was telling someone the other day is, you know, Trump's going to be president for 4 years. And it's like they're trying to do everything in the first 4 or 5 months. And it's like, slow down. You take the foot off the gas a little bit, slow down, and make sure you're doing things through the proper constitutional channels. Make sure you're following the law. Make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. And like you said, I think a lot of his policies would probably go over very well with the American people in large part. But like you said, the approach, I think, is what makes people nervous.
Yeah, and one of the sad things about this is that he actually has everybody on his side when it comes to government. It is a Republican controlled
Mm-hmm,
Congress. He
mm-hmm,
has a Republican backed Supreme Court. He
mm-hmm,
has a Republican president. I mean, he
mm-hmm,
has all the people are in his
mm-hmm.
status. They all agree on the same concept. So why are you having to go in and say, I am the law. I'm doing kind of what I think best when you have everybody on your team to make things happen. Just do it the easy way.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I haven't figured out why that's not happening.
Yeah. I mean, you got a Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican court, get the legislation passed, and nobody can accuse you of at that point of overstepping your Article 2 powers, whatever the case may be. So it's a very interesting topic. And there's a lot we could say going back to Nixon. One of the things when I was reading about this and thinking about presidents throughout American history, and they were talking about uh, how unitary executive theory is also debated in the context of what officials a president can fire and what officials a president cannot fire. And it immediately took me back to Andrew Johnson. And I think we did a 2 or 3 series podcast on his impeachment. And what was the main point of his impeachment is that he violated the Tenure of Office Act, which said that if the Senate had to confirm someone for a position, then the Senate had to confirm their dismissal as well. And of course, when you put a temptation out there for Andrew Johnson, and say you can't fire someone, and Congress goes on vacation, well, guess what he's going to do? It's like putting a piece of chocolate cake on the table and telling me not to eat it and then leave the room. Well, when you come back, there's not going to be any chocolate cake on that table. So I think you see it, even though when we think about unitary executive theory, you really think about it starting with Nixon, moving through Reagan and Clinton and Obama and Trump. But in some ways, you've seen fights between Congress, between the president throughout American history over who has the power to do what type of thing. So in some ways, even though its current form is new, we've seen it, before the struggle.
And I would dare say that you will see it even more so because regardless how you look at this particular president, we are setting a precedent for future presidents. And, I think there's a whiplash effect from the previous president to this president. It's just this huge divide. One really was not as active, and this one is just, I mean, you check the news every hour and something else has happened. And so I think it's just a matter of, as we continue, whoever is in power 4 years from now, this is all just setting the stage for them to kind of do whatever they want to do, whether that's a Democrat or whether it's a Republican. So we need to be careful to ensure that the goal of the founding fathers is still being met.
Yeah.
That every day we seek to ensure that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is for all people at all times in every way possible.
Absolutely, Chris. And I think that is a wonderful way to end this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. If you're listening to this episode and you've enjoyed it, you like what you hear, please give us a like on Spotify. Please give us a like on YouTube, on Anchor, or wherever you're listening. Please give us a like. Please give us a share. If you're listening to us on YouTube, don't just simply hit that subscribe button, and keep coming back, keep sharing this podcast with your friends and family. We have 5 years, Chris. It's hard to believe. We have 5 years worth of episodes that we sort of did a little bit of a dump on YouTube a few months ago, but all of those episodes are there. So we've got episodes on about everything you can imagine, from presidential history to haunted history to even the history of the pencil. We've got it all there. So we do ask that you share this episode with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.